Retro gaming has seen somewhat of a boom over the last couple of decades. Similarly, many modern indie games take inspiration from older titles as well. Often it's just the aesthetic of old 8 and 16-bit games, but sometimes it's an attempt to recreate the original as best as possible. The most famous, and I'd say successful example of this type of mimicry is Shovel Knight. These recreations are typically reserved for 2D pixel art games at best. There are a few attempts to bring the style and feel of early 3D games into the modern age, but as far as I can tell, this is mostly relegated to creating a bunch of Doom or Duke Nukem clones, which were never truly 3D to begin with. The most influential series on indie developers focusing on these 3D adventures seems to be the Legend of Zelda franchise. I've played a bunch of games inspired by Zelda over the years, and it's not even like they're trying to hide it. They often clearly state that The Legend of Zelda was their inspiration. But there's another series that is at least as foundational to gaming as The Legend of Zelda, and that's Mario. But for some reason, I've never seen much interest from developers in creating the kind of 3D platformers that Nintendo graced our consoles with their flagship character. Sure, back in the day there were tons of games that tried to compete with Mario at his own ballgame, even on Nintendo's own consoles. But it seems, at least to me, that most studios have opted to just let Nintendo dominate the space because, quite frankly, they really are the best at doing what they do with their mainline Mario games. It's already impressive how they've managed to pretty much perfect their formula on their first attempt with Super Mario 64. And the subsequent releases on the GameCube, Wii, Wii U and Switch are all refinements to what is some of the most carefree fun you can have with a video game. But just because most studios aren't trying to make 3D platformers doesn't mean there are none. A Hat in Time is very obviously inspired by the Mario games, and I'm honestly surprised at how well it's executed. Not to rain on anyone's parade here, but making a 2D retro-inspired game is a lot easier than making a full 3D platformer that doesn't play like absolute ass. Even just the fact that I can compare A Hat in Time to a Mario game at all should be proof enough that A Hat in Time is a good game, and you should absolutely play it if you even remotely enjoy Mario games. That's not to say that A Hat in Time is perfect by any means. Its independent origins are fairly obvious. While the gameplay is a lot of fun, there is a notable lack of polish that can be found here. It's nothing major or deal-breaking. I found no game-breaking bugs or anything like that. It's just a few small things, like a few enemies getting stuck in the level geometry every once in a while, or the at times frustrating camera, and a general lack of focus in terms of tone and aesthetic that make it evident that this is not an effort on the level of a proper Nintendo title. But here's the thing, the lack of polish, that bit of roughness around its edges are also what make A Hat in Time really endearing to me. There's a genuine spirit of excitement in this game that can be felt everywhere that I really like. Especially in terms of the little narratives you get to explore over the course of the game. A Hat in Time is divided into 4 themed hub worlds that each contain around half a dozen missions that you get to engage with. The first one is called Mafia Town, and here it already becomes pretty clear that the humor the game aims for is substantially different to your typical Nintendo game geared towards children. The backstory of Mafia Town is that an organized crime syndicate has made the island in question their home and driven out most of the island's population and keeps tormenting the few people that remain. You can see how this is a theme that Nintendo probably would have never implemented, especially not with the generally irreverent tone that A Hat in Time displays. The second hub is set in a movie studio. This is probably the least focused of the bunch, since even though a movie studio would lend itself to explore a variety of different themes, the levels don't really do much with them. The general gist of the story is that you're torn back and forth between 2 rivaling avian film directors who are in a battle over a prestigious movie award, so all the missions are styled around filmmaking in some capacity. My personal favorite here was the murder mystery that's clearly inspired by Murder on the Orient Express. For one, I liked the detective work, and I also felt that the crows wearing trench coats were a neat little homage to the government agents from Psychonauts' Milkman conspiracy level. Unfortunately, this also seems to be the only level that really takes direct inspiration from movies and filmmaking. The rest feel rather arbitrary. They're not bad, but thematically not that cohesive. The third hub shifts gears rather drastically. It's set in a haunted forest, and for a game aimed at children, I mean it has a PEGI 7 rating after all, there's a few really scary scenes in here that you wouldn't expect. I'm specifically talking about Queen Vanessa's Manor here that has a few really effective jump scares in there. It's not bad stuff overall, I generally like the spooky, Halloweeny levels in these types of games and it's otherwise quite charming stuff, but that bit was a bit too far. In fact, this is probably a good spot to highlight that while much of the game is fairly straightforward and quite a few missions are pretty simplistic with very easy objectives to clear, there are instances where the game's difficulty suddenly jumps up quite dramatically. Most obviously during the boss fights, which are all these lengthy multi-stage affairs with difficult attack patterns. Thankfully, the game offers mid-boss checkpoints, so you don't have to take the entire thing from the top every time you fail. Maybe it's a sign that I'm getting old, but a few of the bosses really tested my patience here. Still, it felt like a bit of a sudden and extreme shift in difficulty from the rest of the game. Anyway, the last hub takes place in a Himalayan-inspired locale way up in the mountains. From a gameplay perspective, it differs quite substantially from the others since it's a free roam environment that doesn't restrict players to a specific path forward and instead relies on exploration. While the Mafia Town and Horror Hub were technically explorable, the objectives were for the most part linearly laid out, which isn't the case in this Sky level. I like this change of pace a lot. But the downside is that narratively and thematically there isn't a lot present, there's not much of a unified theme going on. Clearing out the objectives only brings about the spread of an illness across the map that corrupts the land and its inhabitants after the fact, with not much building that turn of events up beforehand. This aspect really comes out of nowhere and doesn't really mesh with anything else here. The reason you engage in all these objectives is to gather up a bunch of magical hourglasses, and the justification for that is entirely preposterous. Okay, let me try to explain it. The main character of A Hat in Time, appropriately called Hat Kid, has a spaceship. Said spaceship is for some reason powered by magical hourglasses that can also turn back time. With said spaceship, she is on her way to somewhere and just so happens to encounter the mafia of the planet we get to spend the rest of the game on. Said encounter causes 40 of those hourglasses to get blown out of the spaceship and spread all over the planet. For Hatkit to make it to wherever she intends to go, she has to get back all that fuel of hers, and that's basically it. The story does have a bit more to it when another girl, referred to only as Mustache Girl, is introduced. At first, she becomes your ally by helping you against the mafia, but eventually she becomes the primary antagonist of the narrative when she realizes that the power of the hourglasses would allow Hatkit to undo the mafia invasion in the first place. It's basically analogous to anyone concluding that if time travel were to exist, why you wouldn't go back to assassinate Hitler as a baby. I generally like this development because it gives the villain a logically consistent and understandable motivation. It's not just Bowser kidnapping Princess Peach for the umpteenth time simply for the sake of tradition. And it also serves as a decent point of moralizing at the end when it turns out that with the power Mustache Girl amasses, she ends up condemning everybody as evil. So she doesn't really see how her actions don't end up improving the lives of anybody when literally everybody gets punished. It's nothing groundbreaking here, but for a game ostensibly aimed at kids, that's certainly fine. But it's kind of undone by the fact that the adversarial relationship between Hatkit and Mustache Girl is entirely absent after the first hub world and only comes back at the very end to serve as a final boss fight. I just felt that it was a bit sloppy how the game at first makes a big deal out of Mustache Girl becoming your archenemy and then being absent for the entire rest of the game. What's also notable is that even though the game is called A Hat in Time and the collectibles are referred to as potential time manipulation devices, they're never used as such. Time travel makes no appearance here, so the title becomes even more meaningless than it already is. It's not a deal breaker though, and as I said, the game overall is very enjoyable. The platforming and the different powers that get granted to Hatkit through a variety of hats she can craft with the collectible yarn balls are all a lot of fun. It certainly manages to capture the feeling of playing a Mario game better than any attempt I've seen to date. And as I said, even though the game does lack a bit of polish, that adds to the game's charm for me personally.